I used to believe that trust was a shortcut to speed, that when you're trying to bend reality and build the future faster than anyone thinks is possible, you don't have time for walls or suspicion. But that belief became my biggest mistake, because the people I trusted the most weren't just watching my progress, they were watching my weaknesses, measuring my silence, cataloging every hesitation. Like ammunition for a moment they were patiently waiting for. In the beginning, everything felt aligned, shared vision, long nights, whiteboards filled with impossible ideas, laughter mixed with exhaustion, that rare feeling that you were surrounded by people who actually understand the weight you're carrying, people who say they believe in the mission, not the money, not the fame, but the mission. But someone says that with enough conviction, you want to believe them because believing makes the work lighter. It makes the impossible feel manageable. I let them closer than I should have, because when you're moving at escape velocity, isolation feels like death and companionship feels like fuel. And I told myself that trust wasn't naivete, it was efficiency, it was leadership, as faith in human potential. What I didn't realize was that while I was focused on building rockets, systems, companies, futures, they were focused on studying me. How I reacted under pressure, what kept me awake at night, which battles I avoided, which words cut deeper than I let on. And I gave them that access willingly, thinking transparency created strength, not vulnerability. There were signs, of course, small hesitations in conversations, subtle shifts in tone, moments where support felt conditional rather than absolute. But when you're obsessed with forward motion, you rationalize everything that slows you down. You tell yourself you're imagining it, that stress distorts perception, that paranoia is the enemy of progress. I ignored my instincts because trusting them felt lonelier than rusting people, and I convinced myself that loyalty was something you earn through shared struggle, not something you test through doubt. The truth is, when you build something that matters, you attract two kinds of people: those who want to help you carry it, and those who want to control where it falls. And early on, they look exactly the same, they speak the same language, they mirror your value. Yes, they repeat your words back to you until you mistake reflection for alignment. I gave them access to decisions before they were finished, thoughts before they were sharpened, fears before they were processed, and every time I did, I felt relief, because the burden felt lighter. But what I was really doing was outsourcing my emotional defenses to people who had their own incentives, their own cue, ET calculations. The betrayal didn't arrive loudly. It didn't announce itself with raised voices or slammed doors. It arrived politely, professionally, wrapped in concern and phrased as advice, and by the time I felt the knife, it was already exactly where it could hurt the most. Reputation, credibility, trust in my judgment. That's the part no one tells you. Betrayal isn't dramatic at first, it's administrative. It happens in meetings you're not in, conversations you don't hear, decisions framed as best for the company, that slowly carve you out of the very thing you created. I remember the moment clarity hit me, not as anger, not as sadness, but as a cold stillness, when I realized that the people I thought were protecting the mission were actually protecting themselves from me, from my unpredictability, my intensity, my refusal to compromise on first principles. And suddenly, every past interaction replayed in a N. You light. Every compliment sounded like camouflage. Every reassurance felt rehearsed. I had trusted them with the assumption that shared ambition guaranteed shared loyalty. But ambition without alignment is just patience with a deadline. And I was the deadline. The hardest part wasn't the loss of control or the damage to my name. It was the internal fracture, the realization that my default setting, my belief in human collaboration as an accelerant for progress, had been exploited. And once that belief cracks, you don't just question people, you question yourself. I asked myself where I miscalculated, where intelligence failed to compensate for emotional blind spots, where optimism crossed into negligence, and the answer wasn't comforting. I wanted to believe because believing made the war survivable. That's what trust does. It reduces friction, but it also removes armor, and I had removed mine piece by piece, calling it openness, calling it leadership, calling it evolution, until one day I woke up and realized that nothing around me felt safe anymore, not because the world had changed, but because I finally saw it clearly. And that was the moment everything stopped being about building faster and started being about understanding deeper. Because when trust breaks at that level, it doesn't just slow you down. It rewires how you move through every room, every conversation, every silence. And I knew then that the version of me who trusted easily was gone, replaced by someone who would never again confuse proximity with loyalty or shared language with shared intent. The moment trust collapses, you don't hear a sound, but you feel a pressure, like gravity suddenly increasing, and everything you thought was solid starts to reveal hairline fractures you never noticed before, because once I saw the betrayal for what it was, I couldn't unsee it. And every interaction after that felt like walking through a familiar room where all the furniture had been subtly rearranged. I speaking freely, not out of fear but out of precision, because I understood something most people never have to learn this way. Information is power long before it becomes action. And I had been handing it out under the assumption that good intentions were the default, when in reality incentives always speak louder than ideals. Meetings felt different, quieter in my head, louder in implication. And I began to notice how often concern was actually control dressed up as care, how suggestions were really boundaries being drawn around me, how phrases like "for your own good" or "for stability" were used to slowly narrow the space I could operate in without resistance. It wasn't that I suddenly became paranoid. It was that my pattern recognition finally caught up with reality, and when that happens, it's uncomfortable because clarity is heavier than ignorance. I realized that trust doesn't usually break in a single act. It erodes through alignment drift, through moments where people stop asking what's right and start asking what's safe. And when safety becomes the priority, innovation becomes the threat, and the person pushing hardest forward becomes the liability. I had spent my life being that liability, too intense, too fast, too uncompromising, and for a while those traits were tolerated because they produced results. But tolerance is not loyalty, it's a temporary agreement that expires the moment the cost feels higher than reward. I saw how narratives were shaped quietly, how my decisiveness was reframed as recklessness, my urgency as instability, my willingness to risk everything as irresponsibility, and the most dangerous part was how reasonable it all sounded on paper, how betrayal doesn't need lies when it can survive on selective truth. There's a strange loneliness that comes with realizing you're being manic, instead of supported, that people aren't trying to stop the mission, but trying to slow you down just enough to make themselves comfortable. And I felt that loneliness in the pauses between sentences, in the way eye contact lingered too long or disappeared too quickly, in how my words were repeated back to me days later without my intent attached. I began to understand that when you build something extraordinary, you eventually scare the very people who helped you build it, because extraordinary things don't ask for permission and they don't stop for consensus. And at some point, the mission stops being a shared dream and starts being a force that exposes everyone's limits. That's when alliances shift, not because of malice, but because fear is more common than courage, and fear is incredibly organized. I learned that betrayal doesn't always come from enemies. More often, it comes from people who once believed in you but no longer believe they can keep up. And instead of admitting that, they change the rules so the game slows down to their pace. Internally, I started running simulations, not of technology, but of people, mapping incentives, pressures, reputational risks, and I hated that I had to do it because part of me still wanted to believe that transparency could coexist with ambition, but evidence is ruthless, and it doesn't care what you want to be true. Every decision became layered. What it meant technically, strategically, and politically, and politics had always bored me. But now I saw it clearly as a system of energy redirection, where momentum is siphoned away, from progress and into preservation. The hardest adjustment wasn't external, it was internal. Learning to sit with the fact that the environment had changed and pretending otherwise would only compound the damage. That leadership sometimes means reducing emotional bandwidth so cognitive bandwidth can survive. I became more deliberate, less reactive, not because I was weaker, but because I finally understood the terrain, and the terrain wasn't neutral. Trust, once broken, doesn't disappear. It transforms into scrutiny. And scrutiny is exhausting because it requires constant awareness, constant calibration, constant restraint. And there were nights when I wondered if the cost of pushing forward was worth the constant friction of watching every word, every expression, every silence. But then I remembered why I started in the first place. Not to be liked, not to be safe, but to do things that mattered. And the clarity was grounding because it reframed the betrayal not as a personal failure, but as a predictable response to uncompromising direction. I saw that the people who turned on me weren't villains in a story. They were variables reacting to pressure and understanding that stripped the situation of its emotional charge and replaced it with resolve. I stopped seeking validation from rooms that had already decided who I was allowed to be, and that shift was subtle but profound, because the moment you stop trying to be understood by people who benefit from misunderstanding you, you regain a kind of freedom that can't be taken away quietly. Still, the cost lingered. Trust doesn't regenerate easily once it's been weaponized against you. And I knew that whatever came next, whatever version of me emerged from this phase, would be sharper, quieter, and far less willing to confuse cooperation with alignment, because the lesson had been burned in deeply. When you move fast enough to change the future, you will eventually outpace the comfort of the people around you. And some, F them will try to pull you back, not loudly, not openly, but just enough to make sure you never forget who's watching. There's a moment after betrayal where you either shrink to fit the cage being built around you, or you accept that comfort is no longer part of the equation, and the second I chose the latter, everything became brutally clear, because once trust is gone, illusion dies with it, and what's left is raw intent, raw motive, raw truth. I stopped asking who was loyal and started asking who was aligned, because loyalty can be emotional and temporary, but alignment is structural. It survives pressure, incentives, and fear, and that distinction changed how I rebuilt everything, from teams to communication to the way I carried myself in rooms where silence spoke louder than words. I learned that safety is an illusion sold to people who don't move fast enough to threaten systems, and the moment you act, you really challenge the status quo. Safety becomes conditional, negotiated, revocable, so waiting for it is a losing strategy. Instead of trying to make people comfortable with my direction, I doubled down on clarity, because clarity removes ambiguity, and ambiguity is where manipulation lives. I became explicit, precise, almost surgical with language, not to control others, but to eliminate the space where intentions could be distorted after the fact. The irony is that betrayal didn't weaken my resolve, it refined it, stripped away the need for approval, because once you've been misrepresented by people you trusted, reputation stops being something you chase and becomes something you're willing to spend. I realized that being misunderstood is not a failure if the work is correct, and that truth gave me a kind of calm that no reassurance ever could. The noise got louder, criticism, speculation, narratives built without me. But internally, things got quieter because I stopped trying to win arguments that were never about truth in the first place. I accepted that leadership at the edge of progress is inherently lonely, not because others don't care, but because few are willing to carry the psychological weight of decisions that don't guarantee applause. And once you accept that loneliness, it stops being a weakness and starts becoming a form of insulation. I rebuilt trust differently, not broadly, not emotionally, but deliberately, through shared risk and demonstrated action, because words are cheap in environments where incentives are misaligned, and I no longer confuse enthusiasm, DUI, commitment. I designed systems that didn't rely on blind faith, because mature systems assume human error, fear, and self-interest, and resilience comes from accounting for those realities, not denying them. There were moments when the past tried to pull me back. Memories of how open I used to be, how easily I shared ideas before they were hardened. But nostalgia is dangerous when it tempts you to repeat patterns that no longer fit the terrain, and growth sometimes looks like restraint from the outside. I stopped reacting to provocation because reaction feeds control, and control is exactly what betrayal tries to reclaim after it's exposed. Instead, I focused on momentum because momentum doesn't argue, It advances, and advancement is the only language the future understands. The people who watched me closely learned something unexpected. I wasn't trying to be untouchable. I was trying to be inevitable, and inevitability doesn't need trust from everyone. It only needs execution. The scar remained not as bitterness, but as calibration, a constant reminder that optimism without structure is vulnerability, and that believing in people doesn't mean abandoning discernment. If there's one truth that survived everything, it's this. Trust should never be your default setting when the stakes are existential. It should be the result of time, pressure, and proof, and once I internalized that, the fear dissolved. Nothing feels completely safe when you're building the future, but safety was never the goal, progress was, and if betrayal was the price of learning how to move forward without illusions, then it wasn't the end of the story, it was the upgrade.